So hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I have the pleasure of having Mark O'Donnell on with me again to have an update from him about all the extraordinary things that have been happening with child sexual abuse cases, with the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower Society. Mark, you went down to Australia and you did some work down there. So Mark, tell us what we need to know, please.
Well, thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's really great to see you again. It's been a few months since we've had a chance to talk, and yeah, it's been an exciting couple of months. A few months ago, I was involved in an investigation in Arkansas with a predator who had abused, we think, dozens and dozens of children, and I released an article on the JW Survey website about this man, Roderick Watkins, who is a former Jehovah's Witness elder that had used his position in the organization to form a trust with the parents and the children that he ultimately abused. And it was really a sad story, and we're learning more and more about that as time goes on. So
you don't mean a legal trust. He bonded with them and
right.
got their trust so that he could abuse their child. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I was recently talking to an investigative journalist about this. It's very similar to what happened in the Michael Jackson case, where you have an individual who was a very trusted entertainer, and the parents of many of these children had so much trust in Jackson that they literally threw their kids at Jackson and said, please, by all means, spend the week at his Neverland Ranch. And they fully trusted that this was a person who was looking out for their kids' interest. It would do them no harm. Well, now we have a case within the Jehovah's Witness organization where we have a serial pedophile who did this across multiple states, and it's still under police investigation. But this man, Roderick Watkins, was arrested by the Cleburne County, Arkansas police after 4 families came forward. And there are many more, but there are 4 families who came forward and spoke to the police. And so now he's awaiting trial. He's out on bond at the moment. But so I'm continuing to follow that case, which has kept me busy for the past few months. But there's quite a bit going on. As you mentioned, I was down in Australia. We had a really nice series of interviews and meetups with some former Jehovah's Witnesses who...
Like Paul Grundy, I know.
That's right. Yeah, the founder of JW Facts, and that's a great website for individuals who are looking for just fact-based information, not commentary. Just here's what the witnesses believe, and here's what witnesses don't know.
Lloyd Evans, who was also there with you?
Yeah, so Lloyd Evans was there, and he gave a terrific presentation and also conducted some interviews for a documentary that we're working on called The Truth About the Truth. And that was a real privilege because we got to interview a couple of very important people in Australia. One of them is a federal judge who at the time was counsel assisting the Royal Commission of Australia, which investigated child sexual institutional responses to abuse.
Yeah, that was a fantastic investigation. I wish they would do that in the United States, right?
Yeah, well, it's apparently it's happening in the UK right now. So they're looking into that over in the UK, and as well as a few other countries. So we would love to see that come here. But one of the things that we learned from that investigation in Australia was something that the Australian government didn't realize. They decided early on to broadcast on their government internet channel. They decided to publicly broadcast the hearings, and they didn't really count on the international response that they were going to get from not just ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, but people of all that were formerly of all of these faiths, or still of faiths like Catholicism, or maybe they were in the YMCA groups, because they investigated all groups who had an institutional responsibility to protect children. Right. And they found where they were flawed and where they weren't flawed. And then they produced responsive documents and recommendations, and they even produced a redress scheme so that these organizations, if they choose to, could cooperate with and help remunerate some of these victims so that they could have money to pay for counseling, professional counseling, the type that you do, as well as other types of counseling that will help them get their lives back on track.
Right. So that's great. And when do we think the documentary might be ready to come out?
So it's there's a few more interviews to do. We're actually going to be going up to Canada and interviewing a few additional persons of interest up there that have a lot to say about, in that case, the Jehovah's Witnesses policy in regards to blood transfusions, because we've had a number of people who have died, such as a woman giving birth to her child, passed away because
I wrote a blog about her. She was 27.
Yeah, in fact, I think we actually talked about it in one of our interviews. So
yeah, tragic.
Very tragic. Yeah, that happened a few years ago. So we're going to interview some of the individuals that were involved in that. So once those interviews are complete, then we're in the editing process, and that probably will take more than a year. So I can't promise a date on that, but it takes time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to insert a thing that I just learned last night about a different cult group called The Family. This is an 80-year-old group in the U.S., but they have tentacles around the world. There's actually going to be a Netflix series in early August based on the New York Times bestselling book, The Family by Jeffrey Charlotte, and his book, C Street. And it's a very, very significant and important work. So I'm just giving advance warning for our listeners and our blog readers on that. It seems like the public has a hunger to learn about cults now, which I'm thrilled about. It seems like Netflix and HBO and Showtime and other venues want to know about cults.
They do. Yeah, now that you mention it, speaking of plugs, I just reached over and grabbed a copy of Amber Scarra's book, Leaving the Witness.
I'm very glad you brought it up. Amber's on our short list for doing a video interview. I had the pleasure of meeting her and reading her book. And quick funny story about that book, because there's she tells a story of when she did a podcast in China, that a man from the U.S. started asking her all these questions, and they wound up, falling in love with each other or having a romantic dalliance. And it turned out that this was someone that I had met and known who had read my book previous to
I didn't know that.
Getting the idea about, I should help this person because she's really cool. And I was hoping to talk with him, but that hasn't happened yet. But I'd love to try to use him as a highlight of, it does work, talking to people and asking them questions in a respectful, caring way, over time can really plant seeds and help rescue a life. And now she has this best-selling book that's getting all kinds of awards and accolades. And it really is very well written.
The Witness.
She's a very good writer.
She's a brilliant writer, and I think you raise a very good point. In fact, she's working on, I hope I can say this, but she's working on an article for the Boston, now why can't I think of the newspaper?
Boston Globe?
I think it is. It's the Boston Globe.
My hometown paper.
That's right. You're Boston.
Right.
So she's working on an article for the Boston Globe that has a number of comparisons in it too, because she helps us to see that there are very striking similarities between the Jehovah's Witness faith and the Mormon faith insofar as their organizational control they have over their members. And I think what Amber was saying was that one person had written to her after they read her book, Leaving the Witness, and said that it was just like you were writing about me, and this person was a former Mormon.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
What's so cool about the ex-member community, honestly, that if you have the right lens, which I think is the psychological manipulation and control, the mind control lens, you can learn about other groups, and it actually helps you have reality testing about the group that you were in. Because you go, oh yeah. And that's what people liked about Combating Cult Mind Control and Freedom of Mind. That was a shameless plug. But really,
Well,
people read about my time in the Moonies, and it was like, but you were writing about the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what Randy Waters wrote to me in 1989. And I was like, teach me. And he said, come to LA and I'll introduce you to a bunch of ex-witnesses. And so began my education about the Watchtower Society. And who knew? And I'm just going to add one more interesting tidbit that people don't know about, but I was very involved with a group called the Cult Awareness Network at that point. It was a grassroots movement of parents and ex-members and other professionals. They had state chapters. It wound up being sued into bankruptcy by Scientology. But at the time, after I met with Randy and the ex-members, I went to the leadership of the organization at a conference. I said, you know, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult. And I got so much resistance. They were like, no, they're not. And I'm like, well, yes, they are. And they're like, no, no, no. And I said, so why do you think they're not? Well, they're too old. I said, since when is how long they've been around the criteria?
how is that a criteria?
And then I said, then they said it's too big. And I said, since when is that a criteria? But it took many years of former witnesses starting to come to these conferences and giving talks that people started to understand what I hadn't understood either. The bite model really fits, that this is really from deceptive recruitment, that people don't know that it's not the regular Bible that is being used to teach, to all of the shunning and the blood transfusion, and that it fits the criteria quite thoroughly, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And it takes, for me, it took a lot of humility, and I think it does for other people, to recognize that we were in a high control organization or a cult. Even saying that word cult is something that I couldn't do right away. And
it took me 3 months, Mark.
Yeah, it was a similar process for me, where it just took months to identify with. I knew when I came out that there was some psychology to it. That was the first thing I thought of, was that, if this is wrong, if this is not the truth, there's got to be some psychological reason why I was, indebted to this organization or embedded in this organization. And of course, we know I was born in, as many witnesses are. Right. But how did it have such a strong impact and control over my life? And of course, the bite model explains why and how that happened. Yeah. But I think it does take a degree of humility for us to realize, hey, I was wrong. I was in a cult-like environment. I'm not ashamed to say that anymore. And I'm proud of the fact that we can help others to get out of that environment.
I'm glad you said that, because this brings up another point, and then we'll get back to child protection laws that are being put into place. But there is still a stigma attached to having been involved with a cult, so that it causes people to feel shame or embarrassment and such. Just like, I don't know, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, no one was talking about having been abused as a child. It was just too big a stigma. But
very true.
Having famous people tell their story, coverage after coverage after coverage, it's becoming okay to say. It's not something you meet somebody for the first time, hi, I was abused as a child. But it's not something that you can never talk about if you're being close with somebody.
Yeah, we sure have come a long way. And I mean, just the fact that you're in Massachusetts and I'm in Maryland, and we're having this conversation, and it's facilitated something that, years ago, it would have taken months or years for somebody to engage in that interchange, for me to meet you or for you to meet me. I mean, we didn't have these, we had so many boundaries, we could order a book online and read it. If if it was an apostate book, you didn't want to get caught with it, because you'd be expelled from your church in many cases if you're a witness. Right. But we have this interconnection between not just the internet, but email and all of these YouTube videos and ways to communicate that we never have before. So I need credit technology.
to LA to meet the ex-members and Randy in '89. And it wasn't until I think 95, 96, 97 that the digital age was ushered in. And then we could start sharing information online. And it's causing, I mean, groups that have been around since the 1800s, like the Watchtower, like the Latter-day Saints, they changed their name from Mormons.
Right.
They don't want to be called Mormons anymore. Like, I guess I still will a little bit. But they're coping with the fact that they're a dedicated activist, former members who are scanning their stuff and sharing it, you know, and they're having to account for the fact that they've been lying to the membership for a really long time.
Yeah, that's why organizations like the Truth and Transparency organization or foundation is so important, because you know, we believe in transparency, and I talk to people about this so much that, you know, why is it so important for these religious organizations to have these secret manuals? Like, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm going to be reaching for books all afternoon, but the Jehovah's Witnesses have the Shepherd the Flock of God. You know, this is their 2010 version here. Mm-hmm. And you can see now the new one is 3 times as thick because they've included all the policy letters. I mean, this is literally the book on how to run a religious organization as Jehovah's Witnesses do. And it's a policy manual for secrecy. You know, women are not allowed to read this. Non-elders are not allowed to read this. Very few people know of its existence. Except
I didn't know about it. I knew about their manual for how in custody disputes of how to win custody disputes, but I haven't heard about that. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, and the average witness doesn't know about those custody manuals either, because they don't.
Say a few words about it, please.
Well, sure. In fact, actually, we get emails about this all the time at JW Survey and other areas where I help out. So the custody manual is interesting because Jehovah's Witnesses will go to the defense of their own members who have a child that is a witness where the other parent is not a witness. So when you have a witness and a non-witness, it's extremely divisive, because when a custody battle ensues, Jehovah's Witnesses want the child to be in the care of the witness parent, not the non-witness parent.
Because they want to indoctrinate the kids.
Of course. And so unfortunately, what they do is they spin the organization and its practices in a way it's very false and untruthful. For example, we all know, you know, as a former witness, that we were told that we couldn't participate in sports. And I mean, you know, you're not to be on the high school football team or engage in any extracurricular activities. You're to focus on your ministry and the meetings, and right. We're not to go to college. Maybe you can get a 2-year degree so you can be a dental hygienist, but you're not to pursue higher education such as becoming a doctor.
Because the world's going to end any minute.
Because it is. We're you know, and that's what I was told growing up.
It's not going to, but they said it was.
It is. Right. Yes, many times. However, when it comes to these child cases, what the attorneys for Watchtower do is they present this booklet that goes before these judges in family courts, and it says, oh, you know, we want our children to participate in healthy community activities. And they spin it in a way that makes the judges think that the witness kids can engage in extracurricular activities, and they can engage in normal behavior that other children engage in, with the exception of holidays and so forth. But they downplay all of their practices in such a way that these judges end up thinking, well, they're just normal people.
They're lying to the judges is basically what's happening.
That's what it comes down to.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I have this is tangential, but it's related because you just talked about sports. So Serena Williams, tennis champion, is a Jehovah's Witness. If you're not supposed to do sports, what do they do in their heads with someone like Serena Williams?
Let me address that one. Here's what I know about that situation. She is a self-described Jehovah's Witness. the organization can't do anything about Serena Williams because, as I understand, she's never been a baptized Jehovah's Witness. So
Oh,
there's a big difference. Yes. Now you talk about Prince. That's a whole different matter. Prince was well known to have been a baptized Jehovah's Witness. So had he been, now obviously he got away with a lot. He got away with creating
well,
some
so
of
is
the
Michael
most.
Jackson. You mentioned him earlier. Michael Jackson was raised in the JWs, wasn't
He
he?
was, and he disassociated in 1987. And that's very interesting because I actually had attended the congregation as a visitor at the end of 1987 in Woodland Hills, California, or West Woodland Hills, right after he had disassociated. So I met a lot of the people that had associated with him and actually talked to me about his interrelationships with children, which I found, looking back, 30 years later, looking back on it, I find what they told me to be very, eerie,
Right.
considering the allegations that we now know about Michael Jackson.
Right.
But he was definitely a baptized Jehovah's Witness who disassociated himself from the religion in 1987. Prince was a faithful Jehovah's Witness to his death, which, as I believe we know, he died of a drug overdose.
Right. He probably gave a lot of money to the group too.
We do have evidence that he did. Actually, there is solid evidence that he did, and there's no reason to doubt that.
Yeah.
But Serena is another one who I have no reason to doubt that she hasn't donated quite a bit of money to Watchtower, and I can't hold the document up and show you that, but I'm sure she's a generous person. And
I don't know, but I would like to recommend whoever's out there who's an ex-JW activist, if she is not affiliated officially, they should get to her and just make a campaign for her to disavow the Jehovah's Witnesses, because I feel like she's helped them recruit by saying she's.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I think it's an interesting story. I think you and I could probably sit down and write a book on it. But the fact that she was never baptized, and I don't believe her sister was ever baptized either. But Serena thanks Jehovah at the end of every match when she wins. If she wins Wimbledon, which she didn't win this year, but when she wins the semifinals or the finals, she thanks Jehovah. But I think we have to recognize that individuals like that have their own personal faith and their own personal view of what it means to be a Jehovah's Witness. And she's living in a fantasy world.
That's what I was going to say. Thank you. She doesn't not understand that she's giving, credence and publicity in a good way to a very, very destructive group.
Yeah, I suppose you could also argue the opposite. You could say that in a bad way, she's giving a witness because as a Jehovah's Witness growing up, you can't get involved in professional sports. And yet, if people view her as a dedicated witness, which she's not a baptized witness to my knowledge, but if people view her as a faithful Jehovah's Witness, then they're going to say, well, why can't I play sports?
Right, exactly.
Or go to college or whatever. And that's detrimental to the Jehovah's Witness faith. So Jehovah's Witnesses have been silent on Serena Williams.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get back to a very crucial thing that we want to talk about, which is the child abuse statutes of limitations and New York City. Please share what's going on that's so amazing.
Well, what's really amazing is that Governor Cuomo of New York signed earlier this year in February, he signed into law the Child Victims Act, which is something that they've been working on in New York for many years. And it's, they've had a lot of opponents of this law from the Catholic Church and from other organizations. The child victims opponents.
Yeah, it's not proponents.
Sorry, opponents.
Opponents, yes. But people like Marcy Hamilton of Child USA is a proponent that was helping to get these.
Yes. So in fact, if you Google the Child Victims Act and you see Governor Cuomo signing that bill in February, you will see Marcy Hamilton standing right next to the governor, along with several other people who've supported this bill. This bill is a very important bill. And I won't get into all the legalities because I'm not an attorney, but I will say this, that the bill is important because it allows, among other things, victims of child sexual abuse who previously were barred from filing either criminal or in particular civil cases against the organizations or the perpetrators of that crime.
Yep.
If they were previously barred by statute of limitations laws, they have a 1-year window to justice that begins in the middle of August, meaning, in the next 2 weeks.
Right.
And it extends for 1 year all the way through the middle of July 2020. What that means is that a person who gets a representation by means of an attorney can file a lawsuit within that 1-year window and have an opportunity to see justice when previously the statute of limitations had barred them, even if it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Right. However long it's been, if you were barred by the statute of limitations and your case is in New York, this law will help you get justice. But I have to mention one thing in particular, and this is where I specifically have to mention Jehovah's Witnesses, because while that law is strictly a New York law, it applies to Jehovah's Witnesses in all 50 states because Watchtower is headquartered in New York. Because they're headquartered in New York, and because they are most often the defendant in these child sexual abuse cases, then all 50 states, victims from all 50 states have an opportunity to file lawsuit against the Watchtower organization if they can prove that the elders or the organization had intentionally covered up their child abuse or instructed the elders not to report that abuse allegation to the authorities. Right. And that is what has happened in many, many cases. So, for example, you and I have talked about the Montana case where witnesses lost the $35 million judgment.
Right.
And that case involved the Watchtower organization specifically instructing the elders not to report. They didn't even hide it. They said, yes, we intentionally told them not to report.
Yeah, talk about the two-person rule of their policy, please.
Yes.
You don't know about it.
Well, for those that don't know, yes, Jehovah's Witnesses have it's called the two-witness rule. And I want to make sure it's clear that Jehovah's Witnesses try to separate the spiritual and the criminal aspect of the investigations that take place in a child abuse case. So first, if a person brings to an elder an accusation of child sexual abuse, they handle it internally first. They say, okay, we need to investigate this with 2 or 3 elders. Then they pick up the phone and they call Watchtower's legal department in Paterson, New York. At that point, the legal department advises them of whether or not they are, number one, in a mandatory reporting state, and number two, whether or not there is a clergy privilege or clergy penitent exemption from reporting. Why is that important? It's extremely important because even though most states are clergy mandated reporter states, meaning that a priest or an elder has to report allegations of child abuse, even though that law exists in most states, the states also have a law called clergy penitent privilege. And what Watchtower does is they take that law and they say that all of the communications that occurred between the perpetrator and the elders, between the victim and the elders, between the family members of the victim and the elders, all of these people, they claim all of that is covered under clergy penitent privilege. And Watchtower claims that the elders had neither the right nor the duty to report child abuse in any of those cases. That is the reason that almost all cases of child sexual abuse in the United States are never, ever reported to the police, in rare exceptions.
But in my understanding, Mark, is that those mandatory reporting requirements is a relatively new law, and that the two-witness rule has been going on for decades and decades and decades, and that the headquarters even, I think it was Barbara Anderson, brought out proof that there were over 20,000, reported pedophiles at their headquarters.
Yeah, the numbers are very large. So, going back to your question about the two-witness rule, what that is for Jehovah's Witnesses' internal investigation. That's where that applies. It doesn't apply to the criminal investigation. Right. So there's 2 issues. Number one is whether or not they deal with a pedophile in the congregation is based upon whether or not there are 2 witnesses to the child abuse. And there's almost never a second witness to child abuse.
Right.
So because of that, they actually invented a new rule that we call the 2-victim rule. And they don't call it the two victim rule, but that's what the rule is that if there is a second victim of the same perpetrator, then they will consider accepting the testimony of the second victim in their consideration of not whether they'll call the police, but whether they will disfellowship the perpetrator of child sexual abuse. In some cases, they're only reproved.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean,
means, told that they did a naughty and still allowed to be around children.
Yeah, and there's two levels of that. There's public reproof and there's private reproof, and then there's disfellowshipping. So in the case of the case I mentioned earlier, the Arkansas Rod Watkins case, what Jehovah's Witness elders did is they waited until they got at least 3 or 4 reports that were confirmed, that were told to them by these victims of abuse. They waited a very long time before they actually disfellowshipped, and they finally did disfellowship Watkins. But that had nothing to do with the police investigation. The police investigation was something that they blocked from the moment that investigation started. They never once called the police. It was the family members who called the police.
Got it.
And that is their policy. Their policy is to let the family members call the police, but we are not going to call the police because it's not our duty or right to do so.
So I just want to comment that I had Marcy Hamilton come to my forensic think tank called the Program in Psychiatry and the Law. That's at Harvard Medical School. And she gave a presentation, and I did a blog with a video of her presentation on her quest to abolish statute of limitations across the United States. And I just want to really highlight how important it is in this 1-year window for anyone who's been abused in New York State or an organization, by an organization or a person, that even if it happened 30 years ago or 50 years ago, get a good lawyer who understands child sexual abuse stuff. And I guess I want to ask you if there's any ex-witness that's listening to this. Is there a particular law firm or law firms or a particular website that they could go to explore the idea of whether or not they want to pursue a legal case?
Yeah,
you don't want to
right.
promote a particular law firm.
No, right. There's so many out there. I mean, I've written a lot of stories about the law firms or the cases in California. Many of them have been filed by the Zalkin law firm. I know many of their attorneys, and I find them to be extremely competent, trustworthy attorneys that really care about the victims. I mean, these are, I've spoken to attorneys before that, seem to me to be not that well
interested in money.
So sure, but I'm very impressed with the team at the Zalkin law firm. Another attorney that I highly recommend would be Neil Smith with the Nix law firm. He's the gentleman who won the case in Montana. He and his team of attorneys that work for the Nix law firm. And by the way, that law firm is also involved in the opioid cases going on down in the southern United States right now, which are
good for them.
I think it's the Oklahoma case is just wrapping up right now.
I hope they put some of the executives in jail.
Yeah, they're holding them accountable down there. I will say that. It's a really big trial, and now they're turning their attention to the Jehovah's Witness cases.
So just to be clear, if there's an XJW in Massachusetts, should they be, contacting a law firm in California to sue the witnesses in New York, or should they be looking in Massachusetts?
No, it's a very good question that you ask, and that's the reason why this new law allows all 50 states, victims in all 50 states, to get representation in New York, because the defendant is in New York. Watchtower is the defendant,
So
because
it doesn't matter.
So they will get their pro hoc vice in order to try their cases in the state of New York. So there is a website. We can post a link to it, but I'll tell you what it is right now for the listeners. It's Jehovah's Witness Sex Abuse Lawyers. Excuse me. Jehovah's Witness Sex Abuse Lawyers.com. And that's a website that has it says it all. There's an intake form. A person can call them or submit a thing, and then someone will get in touch with them. And then they can review their case to find out what the evidence is, whether or not there's proof that Watchtower told the elders not to report to the police, which is, again, one of the main reasons why Watchtower is being held accountable.
So I'm wondering also about a class action suit. Is this something that's a good thing to think about doing against the Watchtower, or is it better that there are these individual cases?
Well, I can't comment. I'm not an attorney. I can comment as a person who writes about it. And what I
Yes.
can say is that in Canada, class action is a very viable option. So there's actually two class actions in process right now against the Watchtower organization in Canada. In the United States, however, the cases have been much more successful on their filing them on their own merits. And one of the reasons is that the victims do have an opportunity to get a lot higher financial reimbursement because their Watchtower is headquartered here in the United States. So you have Watchtower of Pennsylvania, Watchtower of New York,
Right.
Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is where most of their money is located. So these attorneys, they make a living doing this. But I will say this, they're helping change laws and force organizations to be accountable. Because if you don't hold them financially accountable, then they're going to continue doing these illegal things like telling elders or clergy not to report to the police, and they're
Yeah,
going
and
to
I think that
continue
they need,
harming children.
and I think they need to name the governing body people and sue them
Yes.
personally so that they feel it personally, and it's
Yes.
not just diffusion of responsibility. That's just how God wants it to be.
Well, in these court cases, yes, that's exactly what happens. Is that there is this diffusion of responsibility. So Watchtower says, that we're not responsible for this because we were only responsible from year one up until 2000, and then from 2000 forward, it was the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses because that's when we formed that organization. And so we see a lot of these cases where all of these organizations are alter egos for each other, but in reality, they all answer to the same governing body who produces the laws and the books that we have here, branch organization, shepherd the flock of God.
Very powerful evidence
It's
that,
all from the same group of men.
and it's amazing that they won't let women read this or just the rank and file. That speaks to my pyramid graphic in combating about how truth varies depending on where you are in the pyramid, or if you're a fringe member, you don't know what's really going on inside.
Well, think about that. When you wipe out women from the equation, you take away more than 50% of your base. So just by being a man,
The most likely
automatically.
to be abused, I might add.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole subject in itself. But I mean, just in terms of the politics of Jehovah's Witnesses, they take one or two scriptures from the Bible that says, a woman shall not be allowed to speak, and the man is, and they take that and they just wipe out all of the skills and the knowledge and the abilities of women in the organization, and they relegate them to being pioneer ministers, cleaning the kingdom hall, bearing children, all of the things that we are fighting against in our society so that we can have equality between men and women and between all races. Mm-hmm. So, we're very much against that inequality that Jehovah's Witnesses are.
Yeah, and then there's another legal battle that will be coming down the pike, I feel, based on discrimination by these groups like the Watchtower against former members, where you're not given the rights of a citizen to talk to your family members, your friends, due to their extreme shunning and all the psychological trauma that causes.
Very much so. I'm glad you brought that up, and I would recommend that everyone Google or look up the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, we'll put that in the blog. It's, what I live by, all this work for 43
years. As do I.
Everyone needs to read that line by line and really reflect on their current circumstances. Anyway.
Well, when it comes to religion, they have, I believe it's Article 18 or 19 that says that a person has the right to change their religion without being penalized for it. Yeah. And yet that is the exact thing that they're doing to Jehovah's Witnesses who, like myself, grew up in the religion. I was baptized when I was a minor, when my mind was still developing. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I knew everything. I didn't know anything. And now, as an adult, I'm being held responsible for a decision I made when I was a minor. And that is something that we as a society have to fight against.
Definitely. That's undue influence. And I
Yes.
want to add one more thing that's such a tragedy for wonderful people like you and Kimmy. Not only, because I know Kimmy well and she helps me, at Freedom of Mind, that she got a scholarship to get an advanced degree, a master's, and because the end of the world was coming,
Right.
that she was encouraged not to do that. And having children, because why would you have children if the end of the world is coming? There's so many people that regret not having that biological window to have children of their own because they were in a group like this.
Sure. It happens in many groups that we put our lives on hold because of the interest of the religious group and these decisions of these 8 men in New York, which, as it turns out, are very, very dangerous decisions. And, I thank you for the work that you've done, because I know that many former witnesses have read your books. As you mentioned, even the person who was in contact with Amber Scora, I think that's a great story, that he was in contact with you and read your books, and that ended up helping her, right?
Yeah, and there is hope, but having connection to people who are in cults that's warm and respectful and thoughtful and asking good questions, not in a confrontational way or a judgmental way, but help me understand. That type of thing, it really stimulates what I think are people's authentic selves that want to know the truth and don't want to be exploited or abused and want to be free.
It's such a great point. And I just hope everybody out there realizes that, if you've left a group, that never forget where you came from, because in order to help those people who are still left behind, we have to remember what our mind was like, an image of our mind when we were under that cult control or that organization's control. And that gives us the ability to have empathy for the people that we are now trying to help escape themselves.
Yeah, and of course the people still in, think you've fallen away from God, so they're trying every time they talk to you to suck you back in, which makes former members put up walls because they don't want to be manipulated and pressured, etc. But this ad gives me a chance to say one more really important point, and I've done blogs about this in the past, which is the notion of help yourself, then help others. Because when you're in a group like the Moonies or Watchtower, you're kind of inculcated to put others ahead of yourself. Like it's selfish, to think of yourself. So when they come out of a group, they're still thinking, I got to put others in front of myself, and they try to help others. Well, they haven't gotten really solid in their own healing.
Just like being on that airplane when the oxygen drops, right?
Bingo. It really is a very apt analogy. And I tell people who contact me, you just left, read, listen, network with ex-members, get shelter. A lot of people lose their employment. They lose the place to live. Take things in steps, then help the people who are still in.
It's great advice.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for all your great work, and you've written a ton of articles. We can add links to the most important ones in this blog that we put out, and we'll do another one soon, I hope.
Well, that sounds great. It's always a pleasure speaking to you, Steve, and good luck with everything, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Mark. Take care.
You bet.